You know, nowadays, crowdfunded spiritual successors to classic game series aren't all that uncommon, are they? Sometimes a bigger dev refuses to answer the call to arms and give the fans what they want, or just don't see the money in that particular kind of game. And when that happens, it's usually up to smaller devs to take that older game's ideas and bring them up to speed with a new coat of paint and maybe even some fresh ideas to change up the formula. A game like Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is a prime example of this approach working well and leading to damn fine success. And a game like Mighty Number 9 is a prime example of why you don't let Keiji Inafune drink. But both Ritual of the Night and Mighty Number 9 have one thing in common. They both touted an extremely well-known producer of the series these games were looking to for inspiration. Igarashi and Inafune played a big role in the directions that both Castlevania and Mega Man moved in respectively, and having that name recognition, established development companies, and massive fan bases hungry for more of that kind of classic gameplay played pivotal roles in why these projects garnered the interest and hype that they did, despite the final products looking drastically different from one another quality-wise. So why bring all this up now? Because the game we're looking at today doesn't fall under any of these banners. It isn't touting the name recognition of a well-known producer, the person working on the game isn't even a part of a dev company at all, and maybe this is just me downplaying the series, but compared to classic Mega Man or Iga-styled Castlevania, Mega Man Battle Network seems like a pretty niche series to make a spiritual successor to, especially in 2020. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a huge Battle Network and Star Force fan. Hell, Battle Network was my introduction to Mega Man as a whole, but this particular incarnation never came off to me as being that popular compared to the classic or X series. And for the uninitiated, the Mega Man Battle Network series is a real-time tactical JRPG spin-off of the classic Mega Man series, in which the combat takes place on a grid-based battlefield, and as opposed to using weapons with limited energy like in the classic or X series, Mega Man's moveset consists of a fully customizable 30-card deck of battle chips, and it's this deck-building aspect combined with the faster real-time combat that opens up a wide variety of ways to approach enemy encounters, and was seen as pretty damn unique, especially given that the series existed entirely on the Game Boy Advance. So, how do you take this style of gameplay and improve upon it even further? Well, according to a madman by the name of Thomas Kang, you crank the speed of the game up to 11, remove any and all mechanics that could break the pace, and you turn it into a roguelike? How well does that game plan hold up? Let's find out now. It's time to take a look at One Step from Eden. Now, jumping the gun a bit, I'll gladly praise Eden for the improvements it makes to Battle Network's gameplay formula, but when it comes to story, it doesn't hold a candle to its inspiration whatsoever. Mainly because there's no story to speak of. Aside from a short throwaway line on the game's Kickstarter page about Eden being the last standing hope for the survivors of a war-torn land, there's really no context given about why the game's cast of characters are headed for Eden in the first place. There's also very little dialogue too, just small quips from bosses at the start and end of their fights, but none of it gives you any real inkling of what the hell is going on, so the whole war-torn world bit is basically just window dressing to give the characters a reason to fight each other. I didn't mind that personally, considering I'm mainly here for the battle system, but it might be a turnoff to those who were expecting Eden to be a one-to-one parallel to Battle Network in all aspects, not just gameplay. Also, quick disclaimer before we get into the bulk of the video, just want to discuss the fact that Eden does in fact have local co-op and PvP, but seeing as how that I'm the only one around here to record gameplay with, I don't have a second person to help cover footage for those modes of the game. I am strictly looking at One Step from Eden from the perspective of someone who is looking into this game as a good single-player experience, and not really digging into any of the multiplayer features of the game. So, I won't be covering any of that for the sake of this review. Hope you understand, given the state of affairs in the world as of late. So as I mentioned, One Step from Eden is a spiritual successor to the Mega Man Battle Network series, and the game makes that obvious as early as your first enemy encounter. Symmetrical grid-based battlefield separating you and the enemies? Check. Card-based attacks of various attributes dished out from a customizable deck that's shuffled at the start of every encounter? Affirmative. Your currently queued cards displayed around your sprite to keep your eyes on the action as much as possible?
You're goddamn right.
But that's not to say that all of Eden's systems and mechanics are ripped straight from Battle Network. There are definitely clear differences that do more than help the game stand on its own 2 feet. For starters, spells differ from battle chips in how they can be used with one another. Rather than having limitations on which cards can be used together, like chip codes or picking duplicate chips, you only need to worry about having the necessary amount of mana to cast a spell. This is a damn fine change given the inclusion of roguelike elements, meaning that the spells you come across are all randomized, with the option to increase the chance of spells with certain focuses being available right at the top of your deck menu. This can be useful because spells of similar focuses usually synergize with one another and can feed into the different ways that you construct your deck. For example, if you construct a kunai-based deck, you'd want to set the /fic focus to get your hands on spells like Collect Ring or Double Take that fill your deck with as many kunai as possible. They're quick-hitting projectiles that do a relatively small amount of damage, but they don't cost any mana, meaning that you can spam the hell out of them without a care in the world. Or, if you're not too confident in your aim, you could split your focuses between /fic and Hearth to increase chances of coming into spells like Sword Row or Swords of Light, to keep the enemy locked in place so that you can have an easier time turning your enemies into walking pincushions. Another way Eden eased translating these mechanics over was removing any need to pause the game to select your spells. The custom window served its purpose well enough back in the day, but having spells cycle through your deck as you cast them is a great way to ensure that combat never slows down, lending to an average playthrough's shorter runtime. Your spells aren't gone after using them either, as running out of spells simply puts your deck on a short cooldown while all of your cards are shuffled back into it. Once the timer runs out, you can go back to slinging spells. In addition to spells, Eden also sports artifacts, equipment that provides any number of effects from speeding up the rate at which your mana restores at to giving you a free Men of Shield at the start of every battle. The last piece of the holy trinity of tools at your disposal are weapons. Character-specific spells that are separate from your deck and have unlimited uses, but usually aren't your strongest source of damage. Hell, in some rare instances, like Saffron's wristwatch, your weapon won't deal any damage at all, and instead has a more passive effect, like slowing down time. Utilizing all these resources is crucial to progression in One Step from Eden, as you'll be traversing 8 worlds along branching pathways that'll lead you through a total of 6 zones per world that all have different things happening in each of them. You have your basic battle zones and mini-boss zones that award you with one of 3 random spells and EXP upon clearing the room of enemies, with gaining levels being one of the primary ways to obtain new artifacts. Another way to obtain artifacts is by defeating chests under a time limit in treasure zones. Campfire zones offer you a small resting spot to regain HP, and there are also distress call and hazard zones that'll find you protecting a hostage or 2 from oncoming attacks, or dispatching enemies with the hostage caught right in the crossfire. There's no penalty for failing to protect a hostage, but succeeding can reward you with a bit of healing or extra money, which can be spent at shop zones across the worlds on new spells and artifacts, as well as upgraders and removers. Upgraders can be used on any spell of your choosing to add an additional property to it, such as lowering its mana cost, or increasing its mana cost in exchange for casting the spell twice with a single card. Spells can be upgraded multiple times, and the effects from each upgrade stack, but the amount of upgraders needed increases by 1 each time. Removers can be used to, well, remove a spell from your deck, though to be perfectly honest, I never found much use for these outside of getting rid of a spell from my starting loadout that just didn't jive with me. There are also these pacts that you can make as well, mini challenges that give you a reward up front in exchange for having a stipulation placed on yourself for a certain number of battles. Some of these are relatively harmless, like taking 1 damage each time you move a tile, but other drawbacks like the Cell Location Pact can kiss my ass. It forces you to teleport to the opposite tile on your side of the field every time you cast a spell, and in certain late game situations, that kind of disorientation has the potential to ruin a run if you can't adjust quickly, or if your deck focuses on a lot of spells that care about your own positioning to effectively dish out damage. Packs don't cost any money to make though, and again, since the downsides only last for a short amount of time, it's usually worth your while to pick these up when you can. The last of the zones you'll be trekking through are boss zones. These are where you'll have a one-on-one encounter with one of 8 possible heroes, excluding the hero you're playing as, of course, and are predictably the biggest source of difficulty the game provides. Bosses' movesets are diverse, they have the highest HP out of all the enemies you'll encounter, and as you face them in later worlds, they'll boast higher HP and expand the list of spells they have available to them. Defeating boss heroes is required to progress on to the next world, of which you can choose between a max of 3 different worlds at any given time, but the fates of the defeated heroes are entirely up to you. If you choose to spare a hero, they'll thank you by healing you for about 400 HP and even show up in later worlds to assist you, but you don't gain any EXP or spells for defeating them. On the flip side though, if you choose to finish a hero off, you'll be rewarded with EXP, 1 of 3 random spells and artifacts, but you'll give up that hero's healing and future support. Regardless of which decision you make though, defeating a boss hero in World 4 onward will unlock that hero as a playable character for future runs, with their own unique weapons and starting loadouts that lend themselves to specific ways to play. A character like Terra, for example, focuses on breaking the enemy's tiles to speed up her mana regeneration and limiting the movement of the opponent, and this makes her playstyle mesh well with the hearth spells that I mentioned earlier, as well as artifacts like Sugar Glass that crack 6 of your opponent's tiles at the start of every battle. Or in the case of my favorite character to play as, Celicy, her default weapon Snowpiercer lunges forward and deals damage based on how much frost her target has built up. So a spell like Cold Medicine that heals the target in exchange for inflicting a lot of frost onto them actually becomes far more useful to her than it is to other characters. And when you start combining frost spells with artifacts like Mint Tea or Snow Boots that recover mana or lock a target in place when they take frost damage, her overall damage output really starts to snowball out of control, pardon the pun. But yeah, that's really the basic gameplay loop of One Step from Eden. You proceed through various zones, defeating enemies and becoming stronger as you gain more spells and artifacts with a boss at the end of each world. Rinse and repeat for 8 worlds and the run is over. This cycle could come off as repetitive pretty fast, but as I've probably made clear from my earlier geek out, that's where the variety of deck building options come in. There's a whopping total of 228 spells and 153 artifacts available to come across once everything is unlocked, and you unlock them by leveling up your game rank. Each level you gain in a run converts into EXP that goes towards leveling up that rank, which is capped at level 44. And thankfully that rank EXP will be retained regardless of whether or not you successfully complete a run. Why do I say thankfully? Because if you don't know what you're doing by the time you hit the later worlds, this game can, and most likely will, dropkick your ass straight into a game over. The combat really stops pulling its punches around World 4 or so, which makes sense given that's the point at which you can start unlocking other characters, but the spike in difficulty between Worlds 3 and 4 felt way sharper to me than the transition from, say, World 5 to World 6, if that makes sense. Though, I will mention that in a version 1.3 patch of the game back in April of this year, the World 4 difficulty spike was addressed, though I can't quite discern to what extent it was addressed. By this point, I'd already gotten myself over that bump in the road and moved on to later worlds. Eden's swath of diverse playstyles, deck builds, and intricate mechanics are as intriguing as they are intimidating to first-time players. And I'm gonna be honest with you here, it was all a tad overwhelming to me when I initially booted the game up. Even with the prior Battle Network experience under my belt, I found myself getting kind of lost in just how many moving pieces the game was throwing at me, and that was with a good chunk of them still being locked behind my low game rank. And to the game's credit, it does try to ensure that you know what each spell does, and gives you ample time to play around with them in between zones. Spells, artifacts, and weapons all have short descriptions describing what they do, and when you hover over a spell on a reward screen, the game gives you a visual demonstration of that spell in action, as well as highlighting any keywords that are tied to it, like status ailments such as poison or frost. You can also spend as much time as you want casting spells in most zones once the enemies in that area are defeated, so you're free to test drive them as much as you want before you move on. Though, oddly enough, hovering over a spell in a shop doesn't demo the spell's effects. So in that regard, Eden is a tad inconsistent on when it wants to be transparent with you about which spells you're throwing into your deck, and when it wants you to throw caution to the wind entirely. In fact, now that I think about it, the game doesn't explain a lot to you in general. There's a small tutorial that details the basic controls and some of the UI elements when you start your first run, but aspects like how character unlocks work, the differences between regular world and dark world zones, or how deck focuses affect your luck stat, and by extension your current run's overall difficulty, the game isn't at all forthcoming with any of this information. It largely just leaves you to your own devices. And considering the display for stats like spell power, attack damage, defense, mana regen rates, and luck are all tucked away into one of the smallest corners of the deck menu, I can't say I'd blame you if you completely missed these little details. I know I certainly did for a good while. And to make matters worse, you can't even check what these stats do without having a spell or artifact that modifies them, because the game considers these stats as keywords in the same vein as ailments like poison or frost that I mentioned earlier. These small oversights and blemishes don't harm the game's quality to me personally, but even adding a simple mechanics section to the library mode of the main menu could have gone a long way in remedying some of the accessibility issues I feel Eden has from a new player's perspective. If anything, I'd recommend you reference the game's Gamepedia page if there's anything you're unsure about. It's a great resource that can tell you just about anything you could want to know, and was an absolute lifesaver while I was taking notes for this review. And at the end of the day, even with those issues in mind, they don't stop Eden from being one of the most engaging, rewarding, and most of all, addicting games I've ever played. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I went into a run solely to double check my notes on something, came across a single combination of spells or a spell and artifact early on, and hooked myself into playing out the entire run, only to look up from my Switch's screen about half an hour later to the realization that the game pulled me out of my typing entirely. And this wasn't a one-off occurrence either. The same thing kept happening multiple times, to the point that I had to force myself to put my Switch away before the game sucked away any more work time out of me. The game is just that freakishly replayable. Though the gameplay wasn't the only thing keeping me hooked to my repeated runs. Another big aspect to me that makes Eden such a joy to play over and over again is its overall presentation. The game's 2D pixel art visuals are vibrant and colorful, with distinctly drawn backdrops for each world. From lush forests to blazing wastelands and freezing tundras, the areas in which battles take place all stand out from one another, while also never making any of the on-screen action blend in with them. Spell and character animations are fluid and expressive, and all of the spell, artifact, and weapon cards have their own individual artwork, with some of them sporting flavor text that are pretty funny references. I personally got a kick out of spells like Explosion, Warpath, and Time Stop. Hell, some of the spells here are flat-out Battle Network references. Like, Life Sword is pretty blatant with it naming-wise, but Power Saws? Look at this, and try to tell me with a straight face that this isn't just base EXE's Hell's Rolling. I mean, they weren't even trying to be subtle with this one. On the other end of the spectrum, though, can I start gushing about the soundtrack now? I'm gonna start gushing about the soundtrack now. Steel Plus produced so many absolute bangers for Eden's OST, and I find myself holding back from defeating enemies and bosses just so I can keep listening to them for a little bit longer. All of the battle themes carry such freakishly high energy that represent the fights they're tied to, and they always get me amped to play, especially in the case of the boss themes. If I had to pick a standout among them, and believe me, that's not easy to do by any stretch of the imagination, I'd probably have to settle on Shiso's theme, Cloak and Revolver. Its fast-paced techno beats and accompanying piano match his character design well, and helped convey his seemingly no-nonsense approach to battles. The tracks outside of battles hold up quite well too though, with special mention going to the track that plays on the title screen, Prelude. It's such a soothing tune that doubles as the perfect calm before the storm when starting a run, as well as a great track to bring you back down once you finish a run. Go over to his YouTube channel and take a listen to him if you have the chance. The man's damn good at what he does, and definitely deserves recognition for his work here. Shifting over to performance though, the game holds up surprisingly well, at least as far as the Nintendo Switch version goes, which is what I've been playing for the sake of this review. Eden runs at a smooth frame rate in docked, though there were some instances in handheld that the game started to chug due to the sheer amount of projectiles on screen at once, such as when I double cast spells such as Blizzard on top of other multi-projectile moves like Firestorm. But these dips are very few and far between, and rarely if ever had an effect on my enjoyment of the game overall. So, with everything said and done, what's the final verdict? Well, if you've been paying attention, it should be pretty obvious. Look, I'm aware that as a Battle Network fan, I'm probably more than a little biased, but I just can't help that. From the slick 2D pixel art visuals, the entrancingly electronic OST, and the sheer depth that Eden's combat and deck building customization offers, combined with the easily digestible run length that boasts a dizzyingly massive amount of replay value, it never stops being an absolute blast to play. My gripes with the game's overall accessibility still stand, but at the end of the day, those gripes are essentially minor nitpicks with what is otherwise a flawless evolution of Battle Network's combat and mechanics. And I cannot stress this enough. For as much as I've brought up Battle Network throughout this video, you do not need to be a fan of that series to get enjoyment out of this game. In fact, I'd argue that having never played a Battle Network game might actually help you get even more enjoyment out of it. This distinct style of combat really only exists in the Battle Network games and Eden, so if you haven't played those games prior to jumping in, this game's combat systems will be a breath of fresh air to you like no other. But seeing as how Eden is a spiritual successor to one of the series that defined my childhood, it's kind of impossible for me to talk about the game without comparing it to what it's based on. It's unavoidable. Game's available on Steam, PlayStation 4, and Nintendo Switch, and to top it all off, the game is only $20. So I assure you, whether you're a longtime fan of Mega Man Battle Network, or this is your first time touching down onto a grid-based deck-building warzone of this nature, One Step from Eden is sure to treat you to a damn good time. I appreciate each and every one of you who stuck it out to the end of the video. I really do mean that, and please, if you know anyone who might be interested, slide this review their way. I'd love for nothing more than to give this game the exposure I truly believe it deserves, and I hope this video has convinced some of you to bite the bullet and give it a shot. And you know, with Battle Network's 20th anniversary being right around the corner, Capcom's clearly taking note of this, what with them gathering partners to produce merch. Combine this with the fact that the X Legacy Collection was released to coincide with the X Series' 25th anniversary, and the Zero ZX Legacy Collection shows that Capcom definitely has GBA emulation at the ready. I'm gonna slowly remove my tinfoil hat here, but if a Battle Network Legacy Collection does happen soon, I'll be all over that. I'd love to have the chance to cover the games that I grew up with, as well as even go back to games like Battle Networks 1 and 2 that I didn't actually get to experience as a kid. Not Network Transmission though, we can leave that game to rest right where it is. But that's enough of my wishful thinking. I've kept you here for more than long enough. Thank you again so much for watching to the end. Stay safe, wear a mask if you absolutely have to go out, and have a good one.